Slavery first began in the early 17th century, when European settlers in North America turned to African slaves as a less expensive labor source than industrial servants. After 1619, when a Dutch ship brought 20 Africans to the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, slavery spread throughout the American colonies. Slavery was practiced throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and African American slaves became the economic foundation of a new nation. As time went on, slavery in the North would not be as popular, but as slave labor was one of the fundamental principles of the South's economy, this was because Southern plantations cultivated crops like tobacco and cotton that were very labor intensive. Slaves spent long hours in sweltering fields, lived in deplorable conditions, and were subject to beatings. The hard labor and torture led slaves to try to escape from the South, often dying or being captured while trying to start a new life away from slavery. Out of many who escaped, one who made a major impact in the United States history was Harriet Tubman.
While there were many people fighting against the practice of slavery in early America, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that changed how people viewed slavery in America. Frederick Douglass, who was a human rights leader in the anti-slavery movement. Harriet Tubman was a former slave that took a stand against slavery in early American history by escaping slavery and becoming an Underground Railroad conductor and an American Civil War asset.
Harriet Tubman was born into slavery. Her exact birth date is not known because the birth date of slaves were not accurately recorded. Scholars speculate that she was born around 1820 in Dorchester County, Maryland. Harriet's birth name was not Harriet Tubman, but in fact Armida Ross. She would later take her mother's first name and husband's last name. As a slave, Harriet had many responsibilities. In addition to household work, she also had to do work at night to ensure that her master's baby did not cry. She had to rock the baby's cradle to hold her in her arms. Every time a cry was heard, her mistress would whip her around the neck. These were her first scars that would always remind her of her practice she stood up against. As the years went on, Harriet experienced a horrible accident that severely injured her. It started when Harriet was caught in the crossfire between a slave owner and his slave. The slave owner wanted to punish his slave, so the owner picked up a heavy iron weight and threw it at his slave. Except that instead of hitting his slave, the victim was Harriet Tubman. This accident almost crushed her skull and left Harriet with a deep scar which caused her many seizures, severe headaches, and narcoleptic episodes throughout her lifetime. This was the final straw for Harriet, and she could no longer tolerate this inhumane lifestyle and would escape, which led her to stand against slavery.
Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery in 1849 by fleeing to Philadelphia. Following the illness and death of her owner in 1849, in order to escape, Harriet made use of a network known as the Underground Railroad to travel nearly 90 miles to Philadelphia. She crossed into the free state of Pennsylvania with a feeling of relief, and when talking about her experience, she said,
"I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees, and I felt like I was in heaven."
There was also an element of loneliness to her freedom because Harriet had left her entire family behind.
"I had crossed the line. I was free. But there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land."
After gaining her freedom from enslavement, Harriet combated her loneliness by returning to Maryland to save other members of her family, including her parents, some of her brothers and sisters, and others to give them their freedom.
Harriet used the help of the Underground Railroad, a secret organization developed to aid runaway slaves on their escape to freedom. To be involved with the Underground Railroad was dangerous and illegal. The term Underground Railroad referred to the entire system, which consisted of many routes to the north and Canada called lines. The free individuals who helped runaway slaves travel toward freedom were called conductors, and the fugitive slaves were referred to as cargo. Some of the conductors were white abolitionists, others were enslaved and free African Americans, and other activists who helped slaves get their freedom. The safe houses used as hiding places along the lines of the Underground Railroad were called stations. Conductors helped runaway slaves by providing them with safe passage to and from stations. They did this under the cover of darkness, with slave catchers hot on their heels. Many times, these stations would be located within their own homes and businesses, knowing that joining the Underground Railroad would be the perfect way to stand up against slavery. Harriet became a member or conductor.
Around the time when Harriet became a member of the Underground Railroad, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 allowed the capture and return of fugitive slaves to the rightful owners within the territories of the United States, and it was one of the 5 acts included in the Compromise of 1850. The act made it impossible for the escaping slaves to stay in the United States and forced the Underground Railroad to transport slaves to Canada instead of the North United States. Harriet would travel at night when rescuing slaves and use the safe houses. If a slave wanted to go back because he or she felt the journey would be impossible, Harriet had to threaten them with a gun so they wouldn't go back. Harriet never lost a slave or allowed one to turn back. The 2 things sustained her on her many journeys were a pistol and her faith in God.
Harriet said, "I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger."
Which meant that she was one of the few conductors that never lost her way leading slaves to freedom, and she never lost a slave she was rescuing. By 1856, Harriet's capture reward had been brought up to $40,000 in 1856 currency value from the South, but Harriet was never captured. Harriet is believed to have conducted approximately 300 people to freedom in the North Canadian Territory over a 15-year period.
Harriet said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more, if only they knew they were slaves."
Harriet's actions would make her one of the most famous Underground Railroad conductors and earn her the name the Moses of her people, because she led slaves to freedom in the North, which meant that some slaves Harriet met refused to be rescued and stayed in slavery.
Throughout her time in the Underground Railroad, Harriet encountered Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a prominent American abolitionist, author, and orator. Although some may say Frederick Douglass did more to abolish slavery by giving speeches imploring people to abolish slavery, Harriet Tubman was more influential because she risked her own life for the freedom of her people. In a letter from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman, Frederick compliments Harriet's actions in freeing enslaved people and states that she was a very brave woman.
In 1861, when the American Civil War broke out, Harriet felt the need to help the Union Army, which would help her once more stand up and fight against slavery. Harriet's experience leading slaves along the Underground Railroad was especially helpful during the Civil War because she knew the South very well. Harriet was the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war, and she guided the Combahee River Raid under the command of Colonel James Montgomery. The raid consisted of 300 free African soldiers on 3 gunboats who disrupted Southern supply lines by destroying bridges and railroads. The mission also liberated more than 700 enslaved Africans in South Carolina.
Harriet Tubman died of pneumonia at approximately the age of 93 years old on March 10, 1913. When Harriet died, she was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. The city commemorated her life with a plaque on the courthouse.